All right, everybody, good to see you. We are going to continue our talk about modulation techniques today. We're going to add a new one. We've gotten a lot of comfortability with the pivot chord, but now we're going to sort of broaden our horizons because, you know, some of us maybe we're not in a pivoting mood. Hard to say. So we're going to sort of explore a different technique for doing modulations. It comes with, you know, some differences, but there's a lot of similarity. I mean, nothing about modulations in general changes at all. And so we know that the pivot chord is very, very common, but we can probably imagine that it's not always the best option. I mean, certainly it would be strange for there to only be one way that we modulate. And so there's a lot of reasons that the pivot chord might not be the right one for us. Maybe there isn't enough time to do it. That's something we're going to look at, kind of a strange thing. But the one beat that's needed for that shared chord can sometimes not be ideal for the musical scenario. We're looking at maybe the melody needs it to be a little bit more flexible, needs it to be something different, all kinds of reasons. And so truly there are many different techniques. There's a lot of techniques for modulating. We're really going to add one alternative to the pivot chord, which is going to be something that's called the altered chord modulation. So we're going to come out of this with two main options here in our modulation technique, pivot chord and altered chord. Like I said, there's a lot of similarities, and that's because keys work the same way. I mean, at the end of the day, we're moving from one key to another, and so the things that make one key work are going to be really, really similar to what makes another key work. You know, we've seen as we've done this, harmony is the same. When we get into the new key, whether it's by pivoting or whether it's by an altered chord modulation, predominant chords still work the way they always do. Dominant chords still want to lead to tonic. And so what we're going to see here, particularly with that dominant relationship, is that leading tones still want to pull us into a key. And that's really what we're going to see. So let's get some specifics here on altered chord modulation. The big thing here that's different is that instead of using a pivot chord, a chord that is shared between the two keys, the altered chord goes directly into the thing that makes the keys different. And so what we really want to focus on here is the secondary dominant part we'll get to, but the fact that we pretty much immediately bring in the leading tone of the new key. That's the main thing. And we've already seen that. This is where that secondary dominant element comes into play, is that secondary dominants are moments where we bring a leading tone of a different chord into the mix, right? Where we have leading tone motion, which adds an extra chromatic element. The difference here is that it's going to be adding the leading tone of a key that we are going to cadence in, meaning that we have modulated there. So this does not make use of a shared chord. There is no pivot chord. And that's really the first distinction we want to make, especially if you're doing this in analysis. The way to tell the difference between a pivot chord and an altered chord modulation is that in a pivot, at the modulation moment, and we'll talk about the timing in a second, at the modulation moment, there is no shared chord that we're looking at here. And so what we see is that rather than trying to go through this shared chord, a chord that sort of splits the difference and is present in both keys, altered chord modulation often makes use of what I term the diatonic partner, and we'll see an example of that in a second. But basically, it's going to be a chord that very much uses a note that is not present in the new key, but instead has a relationship. So we're going to look down here at this Beethoven example, and we're going to look for chromatic passing to be one of our signals, and that'll sort of also clue us into what I mean by diatonic partner. So here's this Beethoven example. It goes something like this. obviously we sort of catch this in the action, right? There's like music going on, and then, right? And then by the end of this, it continues in the key of D major. So let's unpack this for a second. So we start in the key of G major, and we've got a nice little melody here. A lot of da 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 da, right? That's very Beethoven-y to sort of make sure that, did you get that? And so we've got dominant motion to tonic. Everything's good. Now let's get right here. Right, so we've got this 2/6 chord with a little nice accented passing tone. And then, look, this A minor chord, A, C, E, in this fourth full measure. The C natural switches to C sharp. And C sharp happens to be the leading tone of D major. So, first and foremost, that's what I mean by a diatonic partner, is the chord at the beginning of this measure is A, C natural, E. It's a 2/6 chord in G. We're going to end up here in the key of D major. And D major very much does not have the note C natural in it, right? D major is F sharp, C sharp. So we're expecting a C sharp in D major. So C natural is not a D major type note. But that C natural switches and becomes a C sharp, right? So we have an A minor chord, A, C, E, and then an A major chord, A, C sharp, E. That's that partner, A minor to A major. Those are sort of partner chords, A and A. It's the two types of A chords that we get in G and D major, respectively. And so because they sort of, one has C natural, one has C sharp, that should be a pretty clear indication to us that they can't be a pivot, because a pivot is shared between both keys. We know that the A chord isn't shared between G major and D major because Beethoven is actually pointing out that difference. And so we can see how this is very distinct from the pivot chord, because before this A, C sharp, E chord, which has the leading tone of D, we've got a chord which is not shared at all. And so what we can see is Beethoven is, in a way, taking this chord, A, C, E, and altering it to be the dominant of D. And we just head right in there. So in some ways, the altered chord modulation is a more direct modulation than the pivot chord. Pivot chord modulations tend to be very carefully created, very carefully set up so that we barely even notice what's happening, and all of a sudden we hit a cadence in the new key, and oh crap, when did that happen? I didn't even notice that we switched. Here, it's still pretty smooth because it's efficient, but it's definitely more noticeable because we very, very clearly have that chromatic motion, sort of ballroom blitz kind of thing going on there. C natural, C sharp, D. And so one of the big clues for us whenever we're trying to find altered chord modulation is this chromatic passing motion. All right? And so the other thing that we can see in where we place the modulation symbol is that in the altered chord, look right here, we put the symbol on the dominant of the new key, right? In the past, when we've been talking about pivot chord modulation, we put the pivoting symbol, the modulation symbol, we put it on the chord before the dominant of the new key. But here, the altered chord is the spot where we put the modulation symbol, right? So the naming that we give it, pivot chord, altered chord, tells you on which chord to put the modulation symbol. In an altered chord modulation, the modulation symbol goes on the chord that has been altered. In pivot chord modulation, the symbol goes on the chord that is pivoting into the new key. All right? So now, you may have noticed that we got some craziness down here because in the labeling, we've got 565 of 5 modulation symbol 565. That's a whole lot going on. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the naming and the labeling of the altered chord modulation. So I've sort of blown this up a bit. We know that we had music in G that we effectively get to this 565 of 5 and 565 moment. That's very strange because in a pivot, we really focused on how at the modulation symbol, we're looking at a chord which can very easily be analyzed in both keys. That clearly is not so much the case here. So let's sort of point some things out about what looks like a very confusing labeling system. So first and foremost, when we talk about the way we're labeling this in the old key, it's always going to be a secondary chord. So it's going to have a slash in it. Here we can see that we've called it 565 of 5. And so I sort of like to divide that and talk about the two parts of the slash. The front side of the slash is going to be the exact same as the label we give this chord in the new key. So here in the key of G major, the old key, you can see we've called it 565 of 5. The front side of that slash, 565, is the same as how we're going to label it in the new key. So 565 is always a 565, right? The inversion part should be simple. We've talked, even with pivot chords, about how if it's an inverted chord, 6-5, no matter what key we're trying to label it in, it's always inverted. So the 6-5 part being consistent shouldn't be too tricky. Inverted is inverted is inverted. End of story. But it's even more closely related than that because we're saying no matter how we would label it in the new key, 565, that's the same as the front side of the slash in the old key. So whichever way you want to do it, it's equivalent. If you know that in D major, this chord would be 565, that's going to be the front side of the slash in the old key, right? So that's how we get that 565 of part, right? You can never have a moment where down here you say, oh, well, clearly in the new key, in D major, this is a 565 chord. But in the old key, it's, 7 or 3 or 4. Will never be that way. The front side of the slash is always the same as the label in the new key, all right? Now, let's talk about the back side of the slash. The back side of the slash, this is where I think most of the confusion happens, but I think we can clear this up. The back side of the slash, so the of 5 part, is the name of the new key in the old key. That's a little confusing, but it's the name, it's what we would call the new key in the old key. So let's break that down. So I said in G, 5 is code for D. In G major, right, or G minor, doesn't matter. In G, 5, when we say 5, we mean D. Because if you go up 5 from G, G, A, B, C, D, you get to D. So D is 5 in G. And so whenever we say whether it's just 5 or something of 5, we're saying that it relates to D. And so we can start to see that there's a parallel here because we're saying, we just pointed out, look, that 565 is 565 is 565. So down here in the way we label it, the front side of the slash, this 565, kind of connects to what we see down here, right? There's like this diagonal relationship, front side of slash to this down here. But there's also a diagonal relationship the other direction because we just said that in G, 5 is code for D, right? So look, 5 in G is code for D. So the way we've labeled this is really just like two ways of saying the same thing. In the old key, it's like we're saying, this is the 5 chord of D, right? 5, 6, 5 of 5. That of 5 is code for of D. So in the old key, we're saying, this is the 5 chord of D. In the new key, we're saying, in D, this is the 5 chord, right? So really, if we think about this diagonal relationship, boom, 5, 6, 5 is 5, 6, 5, and this 5 is D in this case, right? This is the 5 chord of D. In D, this is the 5 chord. It's a little strange, but that's how we label this. We're going to get some practice on these pretty soon. You just have to remember the ways that we're saying that, and also the fact that where we put the symbol. In a pivot chord, we put the modulation symbol on the chord that pivots, so it's right before the dominant. In the altered chord modulation, we put the modulation symbol on the altered chord, on the dominant in the new key. So let's get some practice.